In this week's On My Shelf, I'm highlighting the best books I've read all year, planning goals for the new year, and talking about my fantasy series Fairendale. This week is the last On My Shelf show I'll do for 2015 because I'm taking a 2-week sabbatical to hang out with my boys and celebrate Christmas and New Year's. So I decided to leave you with the best books I've read in 2015. I've read 130 books this year so far, and I'll have a 2-week sabbatical between now and the end of the year, and, of course, plan on reading even more. But here are the best books I have read in 2015. The best middle grade novels I read were The Night Gardener by Jonathan Auxier and Listen Slowly by Thon Ha Le. These novels were very different from one another, one of them being a spooky book and the other being a literary book, but what they shared in common was a delightful story and lyrical language. Those are two of the characteristics I enjoy most in middle grade books. I talk about The Night Gardener in episode 10 of On My Shelf, and I talk about Listen Slowly in episode 12, if you want to know more about them. The absolute best writing book I read this year was The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr. Karr is the author of multiple memoirs, one who started out writing fiction but then realized that her story was creeping into all those other stories and it felt disingenuous for her to write fiction when she really wanted to tell the story like it really happened. Karr has such a beautiful way of writing that every time I pick up one of her books, I am immediately drawn into a world. She doesn't need imaginary characters or situations because she's a writer who can turn the most ordinary into something extraordinary. The Art of Memoir is not a here's how you write a memoir kind of book. It's more of a celebration of memoir and what it contributes to our world. I'll be working on finalizing my first memoir and writing the rough draft of a second one in 2016, and it certainly made me want to get started on both of those right away. How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy by Orson Scott Card was the most useful book about writing craft that I read this year. Card shares his methods for world building and character development in the book, and I found it incredibly helpful for me because I'm writing my first book series in the fantasy genre. The best poetry book I read this year was Edward Hirsch's Gabriel. Hirsch wrote this book after his son's unexpected death. It's not written like most poetry collections are, but it's one long poem detailing his son's adoption and his growing up years and then his tragic death. It is so full of emotion and beauty and bravery and sorrow. I cried so hard reading it, but it was one of the most beautiful offerings in the world of poetry that I've ever read. I've become a total fan of Rainbow Rowell. I'm not a big reader of young adult literature and probably won't be until my sons are reading in the genre, but I do read it every now and then. One of my book club friends recommended I read Eleanor and Park, and I was blown away by how good this story was. Rowell has this amazing ability to make her characters walk right off the page. She's a master at characterization and building a story that readers will not be able to put down. Not because there's suspense or danger or something like that, but because you truly care about her characters. It was probably the best young adult book I've ever read. I read quite a few good adult novels this year, and the best one, hands down, was Anthony Doerr's All the Light We Cannot See. Doerr won a Pulitzer Prize for this story, and it was well deserved. It is one of the most beautiful stories with some of the most beautiful characters that I have read in a very long time. I also really enjoyed Toni Morrison's God Help the Child, which she released this year. I've always loved Toni Morrison for her lyrical writing and her strange stories, and this one did not disappoint. Best Narrative Nonfiction goes to Eric Larson's Devil in the White City, which is a story about the Chicago World's Fair and a killer on the loose. This was a true story, but read just like a novel, which is part of Larson's style. Plenty of suspense and fear and wonder to keep you reading. Larson is one of my favorite journalist writers and always has a good story to tell. The best parenting book I read this year was How Children Succeed by Paul Tough. Tuff is also a journalist, and I found the book fascinating, even though it was filled with all kinds of research. But the way to balance out research is to offer stories, and Tuff did that with an expert hand and made this book one of the best parenting books I've probably ever read. It's not a how-to sort of parenting book, but the information in it was valuable all the same. Jenny Lawson's Furiously Happy was the best humor book I've read this year. It's a bravely humorous book. In it, Lawson talked about her walk with mental illness. So even though it was humorous, it is also an important book for our world. So much about mental illness gets stigmatized, and usually it's because people don't understand those who walk around with mental illness. Lawson's book helps that, but it also helps those who struggle with mental illness. They feel less alone because of her bravery. It was a great read. Everything You Ever Wanted by Gillian Lauren was probably the best memoir I read this year. Lauren is a mother of an adopted child, and Everything You Ever Wanted is the story of her son's adoption and her journey into motherhood. Her son struggled with behavioral and emotional issues, and I found myself crying in some of the passages because it reminded me so much of our own son's journey into emotional well-being. It was a fascinating and very brave offering to the world, and I'm so glad that Lauren felt the need to tell her story. These stories can be hard to tell, but she did a beautiful job of offering hope and authenticity. I've got some great stories on my list for 2016, and I can't wait to share them with you. In other news, I'll be spending the next 2 weeks planning my 2016 year. I do goal setting every year and schedule out my Sabbath weeks, but it takes time to put all of the puzzle pieces together, so you won't see any writing from me in the next 2 weeks. Also, just a side note, I prefer goals to resolutions, because resolutions are something we can break, but goals are something we work toward. So I goal set in every area of my life, not just my business. I set goals for my family, for my marriage, for my health and wellness, for my financial stability, and for many other areas. It's a good practice to have if we're interested in intentional living. I just finished up the short story The Good King's Fall, which introduces readers to the world of Fairendale. I now have a landing page set up where you can sign up to be notified each time a story releases. You can see it at racheltolson.com/Fairendale. Be sure to check it out. For more about what I do and the projects I'm working on, be sure to sign up for my email newsletter. If you have any questions about writing or books, or me and my family, leave them in the comments and I'll try to get to them in future episodes. For more on my shelf, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for supporting my writing this year. I hope you have a magical holiday full of love and laughter, and I'll see you in the new year.